Okay, they admit it. Well, hello and welcome to another episode of You and Me and Multiple Sclerosis. My name is Pam and I've been living with multiple sclerosis for 38.5 years. And in this channel, I've talked a number of times about the frustrations that we've all encountered as we were diagnosed, or should I say, not diagnosed, sometimes for years. And we all suspected that it was probably because the medical profession as a whole just kind of didn't know what to do in those early years. Back in the 80s, when I first had symptoms, they didn't know what to do for multiple sclerosis, so they kind of didn't even want to tell us we had it. But recently, I just read a post about a book written by a doctor who talks about that very thing. That what life was like before they had anything to prescribe for multiple sclerosis and what happened as a result. So I think we'll just read through that article together. So here is the article that I received in my inbox. It's called The Quest to Solve MS. It's a story that's optimistic. In this article, Stephen Hauser, MD, talks about The Face Laughs While the Brain Cries, which is a book he has published. And I will put a link to it below, but here's the book, and here's Dr. Hauser. And I want to tell you that I believe this is the same Dr. Hauser that one of my good friends had as an early MS doctor, and she found it very frustrating, and she didn't feel like he was really all that helpful. And interestingly, this article is going to, or more or less, confess to that very thing. So let's go ahead and start reading. The article starts with a quote from Dr. Hauser. "I think primarily this is a story of discovery," said neurologist and multiple sclerosis researcher Stephen Hauser, MD, of the University of California, San Francisco, about his book, The Face Laughs While the Brain Cries. It's a story that's optimistic, that imbues faith in science and shows that science can improve people's lives, he observed. "I wanted people to understand the phenomenal progress that we've made against MS, a disease that affects millions of people worldwide." I don't know about you, but at this point in the article, I would not say optimism is what I'm feeling, but I am curious to see what he has to say. It's also a story about how fragile medical research is, noted Hauser, who helped open the frontier to B-cell depletion therapies in MS and led the phase 3 trials of the anti-CD20 agents ocrelizumab, Ocrevus, and ofatumumab, Kesimpta. Ocrelizumab, developed by Genentech, was the first anti-CD20 monoclonal antibody approved to treat MS. And it's certainly one that many of those who have been newly diagnosed with MS are on, and I have heard good things about the results. "It was a miracle that ocrelizumab made it to the finish line," Hauser told Medpage Today. "There were numerous places along the way where this could have been, and for a number of reasons maybe should have been, scuttled. The Face Laughs While the Brain Cries is partly about medical research and partly a memoir. It takes its name from the pseudobulbar palsy exhibited by Andrea, a patient with severe MS whose facial expressions were disconnected from her cognitive intentions. Meeting Andrea in the 1970s was a pivotal point in Hauser's decision to study MS. It came at a time when little was known about the disease. Medpage Today spoke with him about the lessons he learned throughout his neurology career. An edited version of that discussion follows. So, what was MS care like when you were in training? And Hauser answers, "This was a time when we didn't have any real options for MS. Modern neuroimaging wasn't even a rumor. We'd have bathtubs on neurology floors and we'd put patients who might have MS, but we weren't sure, into hot tubs to see if their symptoms worsened or new signs appeared. Either was evidence for MS. Sounds pretty low tech, doesn't it? I'd wonder, have any of you been through that? I think I came a little bit after the hot tub phase. He goes on to say, there was an aphorism about neurologists in that era, that we knew everything but did nothing. Okay, well, all right, now I'm starting to relate, because that's kind of how I felt. And for those of us who were interested in MS, senior leaders would, amazingly in retrospect, advise us not to even try to find a treatment for MS. It would destroy our careers, they said. Wow, that's very interesting, isn't it? Yeah, I had wondered about that because I know one of the neurologists that I talked to said that there wasn't really a lot of attention being put on research into multiple sclerosis because it didn't affect children. If it affects mostly older people, the dollars just aren't there. At least back then in the 80s, that was what was the prevailing view. Looking back, we were also just at the beginning of a new era of discovery, a transformation fueled by advances in cell and molecular biology, medicinal chemistry, imaging, and clinical research methods. As I think about my journey and its lessons, one that stands out is the importance of seeking out a new path, one not traveled by others. We tend to travel together, but it's often the different idea that leads to illumination. That's frequently where the great discoveries are made. Had I been able to step back more often and question ideas that were, in retrospect, based on pretty weak data, or worse yet, were flat out wrong, the story would have moved much faster. Well, that's quite fascinating. The interviewer asks what ideas had to be challenged, and Hauser replies, the conventional wisdom was that the mouse experimental allergic encephalitis EAE model, also known as the mouse laboratory model of MS, was a faithful mimic of the human condition. And I'll just have you know, we still use the EAE model. That hasn't gone away. I've read about it very recently. So it's still a going concern. But Hauser says that model indicated that acute EAE was caused by T cells, and T cells exclusively, and if B cells had any role, they protected against disease. If you removed B cells, the disease would get worse. So the same must be true for MS because that's what happens in mice. And yes, and of course you can see the weakness in that argument because we know that our systems are not all that similar to those of mice. But here was the catch. The pathology of EAE in mice looked almost nothing like the pathology in human MS. So we set out to develop an animal model that mimicked the pathology of real MS, and after many years of failure finally succeeded, spectacularly so, in marmoset monkeys. But we were still wedded to the idea that T cells alone must cause MS. We spent years trying to dissect out the components of the immune system that were responsible. We tried to produce the disease in marmosets using T cells alone, but after years of trying, all that T cells could produce was something similar to mouse EAE, never the MS-like pathology. It was only when we tested B cells and antibodies that an explosive demyelinating pathology identical to human MS was reproduced. This overturned, at least in our minds, the conventional wisdom that MS was a purely T-cell mediated disease. And yes, I remember that when I was on Copaxone, that was what we were told, was that Copaxone basically turns rogue T cells into benevolent T cells. And we really didn't even talk about B cells or what effect those might have on the disease. Hauser goes on to say, we published this in top-tier journals, Annals of Neurology, Nature Medicine, and JCI, the Journal of Clinical Investigation. We had the story out, but still people said it's biologically implausible. Everyone knows, they said, that T cells alone cause MS. This new model was an anomaly. It must have nothing to do with actual MS. 2 lessons. Believe in your data and question conventional wisdom. And I think this channel, we've talked a lot about that. Conventional wisdom isn't always as wise as is thought. We need better opportunities for young people to pursue novel avenues and challenge entrenched ideas. They need adequate resources to let them spread their wings. As for me, how did that happen? Foundations and philanthropists and fantastic visionary leaders in industry. The interviewer asks, but even in industry, some people insisted B-cell therapy wouldn't work. And Hauser replies, the Genentech prognosticator model said that the chance of a B-cell therapy working in MS was less than 15%. There was also a flaw in my argument, and I'll talk about that in a moment because that would soon come to the fore as well. Despite the widespread reservations in some corners, Genentech nonetheless approved an initial $60 million pilot experiment to see if this biology worked at the bedside. The bedside, that's where the rubber meets the road. But then the FDA said, we won't let you do this. It's too risky. We'll let you treat half the number of patients you want and administer only 1 dose of the drug that you propose to give. And that's when I realized how tenuous this project was. We thought at the time it was antibody that we were targeting. We'd shown that the oligoclonal bands were being made by these B cells, and these antibodies were directed against multiple myelin targets. B cells weren't what we were going after, it was the antibodies that B cells made. But B cells first need to differentiate into plasma cells to make sufficient quantities of antibodies, and plasma cells can live for 100 years. So we would need to winnow down the plasma cell producing factory for this therapy to work if antibodies were the culprit. And now the FDA was saying we can only treat once and observe for 6 months. There was not enough time for the antibodies to be removed. The prognosticators at Genentech now estimated that the chance of success was even lower, less than 10%. It was a Friday afternoon in 2006, the last Friday of September, when we unblinded the study. We were hoping to see just a hint of benefit so we could go back to the FDA for a longer trial. What we saw was an immediate and almost complete, over 90% elimination of MS disease activity. That was the best scientific outcome imaginable. Not only did we have a therapeutic that could potentially have immense benefit potential for patients, but the immediate benefit told us that our underlying scientific idea was not entirely correct. The B cells themselves, and not just antibodies, were responsible for MS attacks, and that changed the future direction of research, sending us back to the lab trying to understand how B cells function as direct culprits in MS. I love learning about what's been happening behind the scenes. And I appreciate that Dr. Hauser told us honestly that in the beginning, the doctors, the scientists were very evasive, I think, about MS and what to do. Patients did not really feel like they were getting the straight answer, but we sort of suspected that there was more that was known that we weren't being told. When I first went to the doctor with optic neuritis, they sent me to an eye specialist. And the eye specialist, I guess, consulted with a neurologist kind of quietly on the side. But he wasn't really happy that the neurologist said to me that it might be multiple sclerosis, because the eye doctor was very quick to reassure me that, oh, no, it's hardly likely that it's going to be MS. So, don't even think that. But the other alternatives that were presented to me weren't that much more attractive. There was the one about alcoholism, which really would have been a surprise since I was not much of a drinker. There were other reasons why a person might get optic neuritis that had nothing to do with MS, and that is true. But I wasn't seeing those as being much more reassuring. And there wasn't that much more that the doctors could tell me or direct me toward. So I would really say that a lot of my journey with MS has been self-directed, and researching on my own has unearthed a lot of practices that I can do in my life to make it just generally better. But as I said, I do appreciate that Dr. Hauser is disclosing what was going on in those early days of MS research. And also we get some good insights into how a scientific breakthrough actually happens. It's met with a lot of skepticism initially. And so we see that even today with some of the therapies that are proposed. They do meet with skepticism. Oftentimes it is deserved, but not always. Thank you, Dr. Hauser, for this important contribution to our understanding of what was going on in the medical world as we dealt with multiple sclerosis. Well, that was certainly fascinating. I'm glad to know it. I feel somehow validated by reading that article, and I hope that you do too. I've ordered the book, and I'll let you know if there are other insights in it that I think are worth sharing, and I'll link to it below. I know that some doctors still have those old ideas about starting with as minimal an impact as possible, even though many other doctors are saying hit MS early and hit it hard. I'd be curious to know, number one, what's been your experience, and number two, what's your opinion? Because there seems to be no one right answer when it comes to MS, just as there's no one MS. There's no one course, there's no one set of symptoms that everyone gets. We're all individual. And of course we are all individual. Let's never forget that. We each have importance and value for our lives in this world. So with that said, that's all I have for you today. But of course, my number one request is that you take really good care of yourself. And I'll see you again in my next video.